Hi, everyone. I'm glad you're here because today's episode is a doozy. Today, I have three stories that nearly shattered everyone involved as they tried to rationalize what happened to them. Just wait until you hear what you're about to hear. So, if you're enjoying the channel, don't be invisible. Let us know you're out there and smash that subscribe button so we can always be together. Thanks. Now, let's get into the stories. When I was with the Park Service in West Virginia, we used to host a Scouts program. They spent a lot of hours on volunteer projects, and part of their service involved helping to restore parks throughout the county. Our area was a popular place for them to come and do trail maintenance and improve the campgrounds in many ways. Just clearing the area of trash and debris alone was a great service they provided. We were hosting a group like that about 5 years ago, and that's the year I got more than I bargained for. The age group was between 10 and 12 years old. It was their last camp of the year, and they were making the most of it. They had worked hard all day, and some of their junior assistant leaders put together a night game for them. It was meant to be a kind of spooky game where they could just let off steam after hard days of work. It involved the kids completing some kind of task while the junior leaders tried to scare them. I was pretty new to the job then, so I didn't know if that was a common activity or not. It was a bit before Halloween, so I was guessing they were just getting into the spirit of the season. Myself and another ranger had given a talk earlier in the evening, and we were just kind of facilitating the gathering and making sure everybody stayed within the boundaries. Some of the assistants had to put on some monster masks, and we were hiding out in the woods close to the checkpoints the scouts had to pass. I was going in between checkpoints, keeping an eye on things. There was an open stretch of forest near the upper boundary where I decided to hang out on this big rock so that no one would go too far. I had my flashlight off though, so I wouldn't mess up the game. But it was the kind of dark that plays tricks on your eyes, and you start imagining things that aren't there. I was sitting there, and I thought I saw a shadow that was around my size running through the trees a few times. I couldn't see it very well, so I just assumed that I was imagining things because nothing was there when I turned my flashlight on. I had been there quite a while, and it was getting kind of late. I was pretty sure the game would be over soon and everybody would go back to the fire to have s'mores. But then I saw the shadow again. This time I could see it vaguely standing near a tree not too far away from me. I thought it might be one of the assistants hiding to scare the kids. I decided to go over since it was about time to go back. I was still some distance away, but when I got closer, I aimed my flashlight toward the tree. There was definitely someone very tall standing there, but when my light hit its face, I was shocked to see reflective red eyes looking back at me. I started to feel dread. Something felt off. I started to ask if everything was okay, but then I saw that this thing had huge black wings that covered most of its body. My mind tried to rationalize it away. I tried to tell myself that it was just someone who had decided to use an elaborate costume, but I knew it wasn't true. This thing wasn't human. Besides the red eyes, it didn't seem to have any facial features, just darkness. Plus, it was taller than me by about a foot. It lifted up its wings and it made a god-awful piercing shriek, and it jumped straight into the tree behind it where it could look down on me. It was slowly turning its head back and forth like it was waiting for something else to come. Something inside me told me just to run. It didn't matter if it was just a stupid prank. I felt this unholy fear. If it wasn't a prank, I felt like I was in serious danger. I ran as fast as I could. I thought I heard it following me in the trees, but I couldn't take the time to look around. I arrived back at the campfire, and it looked like everybody else had already gotten back and was just milling around, laughing and joking. I went and found the other ranger there and told him what happened. He just looked weird at me, thinking I was making it up. He had been employed there longer than me. I felt like he was looking me up and down, like I was dumb, like a dumb whippersnapper who didn't know how to act in the woods. I just shut up after that, and I started to question my own sanity. Everybody else was just having a good time, but my adrenaline was really jumping. I just kept circling the camp and shining my light into the woods whenever I thought I heard anything. Eventually, the party died down, and everybody went back down the trail to their tents. I stayed by the fire a good long time, thinking I had chosen the completely wrong kind of work. The next day I went back to that area to check it out, but I never found anything but endless trees. Well, I did find a big black bird carcass, but that could have been from anything. It's not like it was the first one of those I had ever seen. In spite of that creepy night, though, I did stay with the job. Even though I did end up leaving that area the next summer, I ended up with the city parks department in New York City. Now, there are some stories. Plenty of freaks up there, too. I'll tell you about it later. My family always longed to travel. When we were kids, we couldn't afford it. My mom, a single mom, would always talk to us and dream about all of the sights in the United States that she hadn't yet had the opportunity to see. We wanted to see those things too. So once we siblings got older, we made a list of all the places our mom described and promised that we'd all make our way through the destinations, one at a time. We took her to a few of them. She enjoyed Crater Lake the most, but unfortunately, she didn't get around to the Grand Canyon until after she died. So let me explain. Once Mom died, my siblings started to give up on the list. It wasn't the same without Mom, they said. I felt the same as the rest of them, but I just wasn't ready to give up yet. The road trips across the country to check out the last remaining wonders of the USA became my way of staying close to her. I'd even talk to her on the road. I'd ask her what she thought of all my favorite views. When I finally made it to the Grand Canyon, it felt bittersweet. It was the last destination on my list, and my list represented my mom's bucket list, complete now thanks to my dedication. But it also meant that I'd have to find a new way to bond with Mom. While there, I started to think about how I wasn't ready to say goodbye to these trips. So I booked an extra long stay in the area so that I could return to see the canyon one more time before heading home. The first day was exactly the wonder and spectacle that you would expect. You don't know how small you are until you're faced with the great scope of the earth. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time describing the canyon. I'm not good at that kind of thing. But what I do want to describe is what I saw on the second day. Dusk was approaching. The descending light framed the rocks and the sand beautifully. It was different than the broad daylight view that I had enjoyed on my first day. So I asked Mom what she thought, and I waited for an answer. I never heard her voice. We don't talk that way. Usually I just get a feeling. That night I did receive the feeling that she was there, but it was interrupted by a light in the distance. I was alone at that particular overlook. I had purposely chosen a less crowded area to admire the canyon. The light demanded my attention, especially since it wasn't coming from the road in the distance or the town that I knew was further back. Red blinking lights began flickering near the bottom of the canyon. I thought perhaps there was a road down there. It was an emergency vehicle, maybe. Maybe I hadn't seen them descend into the canyon. The idea of somebody being rescued out of the bottom of the canyon guaranteed that I wouldn't be looking away. It was unexpected, magnetic, but it was not a vehicle at the bottom of the canyon. I know this because the longer I stared, the more I saw it. There was a large triangular shape visible on the canyon floor. The blinking red lights revealed more of it as time went on. Otherwise, its colors were obscured. It looked disguised in some way. It was as if the triangular body was colored exactly the same as the canyon around it. Now I wondered if it was a jet, some type of military craft, in disguise. No, it wasn't flying, and I had no reason to assume it could be, but jets were the only vehicles I knew of that depended on such great stealth. And then the triangle began to levitate. As it rose from the ground, its canyon-colored veil seemed to disappear. Now it looked black, metallic, and massive. I could have parked my car on its back and still had room to walk around. I watched as it climbed out of the canyon and continued to climb. I asked my mom if she was seeing the same thing. Again, there were no words, no feelings, but I felt confident that she was there with me. There's no way she would let me face this alone. Besides, someone would have to believe my story. I was already repeating how unbelievable this encounter was in my head at the time. The longest point of the triangle then turned and seemed to fixate on my position. The red strobe changed its pattern, and now I'm wondering if it was trying to communicate. I've tried to learn Morse code ever since that night, but I can't perfectly recall the way the lights were blinking. I only remember feeling glued to it. I was like a moth being pulled to a flame. This craft and I stared at each other. It seemed to be waiting for something. I can't explain it, but I suddenly felt my mom more strongly than before. It didn't just seem like the craft was observing me. It felt like she was looking down from somewhere up above. Imagining her in that ship instead of somewhere in heaven made me smile. She would have had some great views from inside that thing. And then the vehicle dashed into the night, tore towards the clouds at a blistering speed. Didn't make any sound either. The next day I asked around. There were a few reports of strange shapes in the sky. I wasn't the only person with their eyes watching the Grand Canyon, after all. What I want to know was, why did I feel the way I did? Why did I feel like she was there with me? Has anybody ever talked about that before? Was it something genuine? Was I in shock? Was it even real? I want to know the theories, and I want to know if I should go back looking for it again. I'm sure you've heard that we all have a doppelganger somewhere in the world. That's something that has been told to me personally at least a dozen times in my life. It's always said by someone who seems to have a little bit of scientific basis for the claim, but has never presented it as a fact with any kind of proof. You've probably also heard from people who claim to have met their doppelganger, or maybe you've even seen yours. So with that in mind, what I'm about to tell you will probably seem underwhelming at first, but I promise this was more than a doppelganger. This was some cross-dimension weirdness that I have never been able to wrap my head around. In August of 1996, I was a 10-year-old kid with a 13-year-old brother and a 6-year-old sister. Our dad had died earlier in the summer in a car accident. He'd been on his way to the store for my mom, who had forgotten to buy milk during the weekly grocery trip that morning. Mom had a really hard time with it, not only with losing Dad, but also blaming herself for having to send him back, even though it wasn't her fault at all. As a result of blaming herself, she had slipped into a depression, a funk. My older brother had been doing most of the parenting for the last few months, even though he was barely a teenager. So we were a very different family than we had been just months earlier. At the time of Dad's death, we had been planning a family trip to Disney World. Mom was committed to taking us still, even in her emotional state, because it was something Dad had been looking forward to, and she'd promised us kids. So in August, as planned, we got in the car and took the drive down to Orlando from Atlanta, where we lived. It would be about a 6.5 or 7 hour drive. The day we got to Disney started out seemingly normal for a day there. We went on rides, saw the sights, and just generally enjoyed ourselves as much as we could. It wasn't until the haunted house ride that things started to get strange. That ride is surprisingly sentimental. After watching the ghosts, who were still in love and dancing through the walls with the loves of their lives, Mom needed a moment to herself. So she took a seat at a food station and sent me, my brother, and our sister to meet Minnie Mouse, who was scheduled to make an appearance shortly at one of the photo tents. We were waiting in line when suddenly we heard somebody call our names, a male voice. It sounded just like Dad. We turned and we looked, and there he was, our dad, frantically scanning the crowd for us. We all froze. We didn't know what we were looking at, but we knew we could all see it and that we weren't just imagining it. I whispered to my brother, "Is that Dad?" And he just shook his head and said, "It can't be." But it was. He saw us and he started walking towards us. My little sister ran over and jumped up into his arms, crying and hugging him. He was comforting her, saying it was okay, that he knows it's scary to get lost, but he was right there the whole time. I looked at my brother and he looked at me. We both knew that something very weird and potentially dangerous was going on. My brother ran over and grabbed my sister out of the dad lookalike's arms. I ran with him, and then we all took off as fast as we could back to where we had left Mom. The guy took after us, chasing us the whole way. When we got to Mom, she stood up and in a hurry asked what we were so scared of. She could see it on our faces. My sister was crying, beating on my brother's back the whole time he ran with her, screaming for him to let her down because she wanted to see Daddy. So when we got to Mom, and my sister was screaming, "I want Daddy," over and over, Mom thought that the haunted house had bothered her too. She took my sister in her arms and was saying, "Daddy's in heaven, but he can still see us though." She was trying to comfort her and calm her down, but it wasn't working. My sister pulled back away from my mom and then said, "Daddy's right there," and pointed back into the crowd. Mom looked. She saw him too. The man that looked like Dad was standing there staring at Mom, with his face as white as a sheet, and then he was shaking and starting to cry. Mom looked at him with the exact same expression. She said, "Eric." The man looked and said, "Laura." Both of the names were right. And then at the exact same time, they both shook their heads and said, "You died when you went to get the milk." That's when 3 kids who looked just like me and my siblings came running through the crowd, yelling for their dad. He turned and saw them and gave us one last glance before he took off, grabbed them, leading them away before they saw us too. We didn't stay long at Disney after that. Mom hurried us out and we went to the beach and then SeaWorld for the rest of the day. And we never really talked about what happened that day until earlier this year, after cancer took Mom away. We were all older now. My brother, sister, and I started talking about the Disney run-in the day after Mom's funeral. And we all had different ideas about what it could have been. My brother thinks it's just a wild coincidence that some people who looked very similar to our family and had at least a few of the same names and circumstances happened to have been there at the same time. Well, that's ridiculous. That's impossible. My little sister thinks it was a ghost and that the doubles of us were something that we just imagined in order to make sense of what had happened over the years. Personally, I believe that somehow we crossed dimensional paths with ourselves, our own family, living in Mom's alternate world of what if? What if she had gone for the milk that day instead of Dad? What if she had never felt the need to blame herself for what happened? I guess we'll never know for sure, but I do know this: what we saw was very real, and it has affected me every single day since.